of the notion that the name is a house that you're born into, but that you need to make into your own home. You need to inhabit it.
My name is Ben Charland. You're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Mavis Himes, a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst with a full-time private practice in Toronto, Ontario. She's also the author of 2 books, The Sacred Body, A Therapist's Journey from 2002, and from 2016, The Power of Names, Uncovering the Mystery of What We Are Called. And it's on that second book that this conversation focuses. It's a really interesting conversation. We talk about names as ethnic markers, about Jacques Lacan, who is a very big influence on Mavis and her work, the importance of a name, how the given or donated name, your first name, is different from your inherited name or your last name, the idea of a name shaping you through life, and how life might be differently lived with one name versus another, even if you are the same person. We talk about narrative and story, and the idea towards the end that our society today and our place in it is becoming untethered. Now, if you like this conversation, please give this podcast a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or on whatever podcast app that you use. You can also go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, to find all the show notes for this episode, all the references to the things that we are discussing, and of course more about Mavis herself. And at that website, you can listen to every other episode of this podcast, and you can get in touch with me by email or on social media. Let me know what you think of this episode or any other. Let me know what topics you'd like to be discussed in the future and what guests you think should be on this program. Finally, let me know what on earth you think is going on. Okay, Mavis Himes, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm delighted to be here with you in your office in Toronto. There's a lot that I want to talk with you about and dig into. Not only the power of names, which is the name of one of your books, but also your practice as a psychologist and psychoanalyst for over 35 years. There's a lot of experience, I think, with you, but also in this room that would be cool to have you share. But before we get there, there's this question, this interesting question, what on earth is going on, the name of this podcast. And it's interesting to me still to this day because it kind of throws people for a loop sometimes. When I ask someone what on earth is going on, sometimes they take it in terms of their topic, sometimes they take it in terms of what's happening today. But I think the tone of that question is important, right? When I first came up with this podcast, that question was an urgent, eager, anxious question about the world we're living in. What on earth is going on? Because the tone of that question means, why is this happening? Why is the world like it is today? But because of that, the question has this kind of broad spectrum of where it can go. And that's for you to decide. And don't worry, you're not going to decide the whole rest of the conversation. You're just gonna set us up with some improv if you like. But Mavis, let's go there. What on earth is going on?
What on earth is going on with the weather, with the environment, with politics? And where I go right now, because I have been thinking about the topic of names, was what on earth is going on that today we are still dealing with discrimination and prejudice based on a person's name. I mean, to me, it's unbelievable that in 2019, coming up to 2020, that this is going on. That we look at a list of names and we still look at foreign-sounding names, Arabic-sounding names, and that people respond to with job applications, with university applications. There are studies that now show that there's still ongoing discrimination based on a name. I find that quite outstanding.
And there's gender in there too. Like if I'm looking at a name, it's like, and some names are confusing. Which gender is that? As if I need to know.
Right. But we don't really think about it, but names really, surnames in particular, are ethnic markers. You've got the MacLeods, the O'Learys, you've got Stropolis, anything that ends in OS. You've got Wang, Wang. You can identify Asian, the Van, whatever, Dutch. You've got names ending in Ov, Ostrov and Postrov, and we can identify who someone is and what their ethnic background is based on their surname in many cases. So when you look down a list of applicants, and there are studies that are now out in North America and abroad, that universities are still, it's in there. I find that shocking.
I mean, and this is something you've talked about in your book personally, that your name, Himes, your last name, is actually a shortening of it. Is it Haimovich?
It was Haimovich, and my father was one of 9 siblings. And in the 40s in Montreal, at a time when there was a lot of Anglo-Franco discrimination, the tension between the two solitudes, if you want, and it was after the war, and so there was still a lot of anti-Semitism going on, and it was very common for Jewish families to change, to whitewash, to anglicize their names for business purposes. And it's interesting that you mention that, because when I wrote the book, I was thinking of that experience, of my father's generation, excuse me, and all of the Jews who came over and who wanted to change their names to fit in. And today that's not the case. Today it's the Muslims who are changing their names, who are wanting to whitewash their names.
Right.
And other people coming from other cultures. But I think the Muslims are really having a hard time with this.
Yeah, I mean, even I remember when Barack Obama ran for president. That was a campaign that had a lot to do with his name.
Exactly.
And what was so interesting about that 2008 presidential campaign was it was opening up the idea that someone without that normal Anglo-American name could be president of this country. Not only a black man, but also a man with the name Barack Obama. More than that, Barack Hussein Obama, which reminded people of Saddam Hussein.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
I think that was a pivotal cultural moment for maybe the Western world, but specifically for the United States, to come to terms with a different kind of name and to bring that into acceptance. And because we normally talk about race and ethnicity when we talk about Barack Obama as a revolutionary election, not just as a president, but as a person being elected. But there was a lot to that name. And I remember 2006, 2007, I think maybe he was on the cover of Time magazine at some point saying, could this be the next president? And it was as if. That was the feeling, the sentiment at the time. Like, no way, what a long shot. Maybe in 50 years. Right. Because of the blackness, but also the name was a big part of that. Yeah.
Right. Because the name announces who you are, in a sense. So it's interesting sometimes when you think you've got an interview with someone whose name may be Asian sounding, and then you meet this Caucasian person because it's a woman and she's married and she's taken on her husband's name. So we do it unconsciously. We anticipate, or we have an idea of who we're going to meet based on their name, and often it doesn't line up.
Yeah. It's fascinating because how much of our lives are about trying to assess another person or assess ourselves based on this one single moniker that comes often before we meet somebody, whether it's a blind date or an interview. I mean, obviously in classical music, if you're playing an instrument, blind auditions are now becoming a thing. Well, how can we do that with names without squeezing out the humanity? And I'm thinking, do we give everyone a number? Because we can't judge a number, but I mean, a number means nothing. 01785, maybe that's my number. The only way that can mean something is if I know where it began and know where it ends, and I know where you fit in there, some kind of chronology. But there's something inhuman about that. And I wonder if that
Well, when you strip away the name, right, then you become a number, and then you go to Nazi Germany, right? Yeah. Where, Jews and gypsies were stripped of their names and they became number. Because the name is actually what distinguishes us from the animal kingdom, if you think of us as being an extension of the animal kingdom, is that we have language. I'm not saying communication because animals communicate, but we have generative language. And we name. We not only name at birth, but we name at death as well. We have a grave. We mark a tombstone with our name to say this person existed. And animals don't name because they don't have generative language. However, we name our pets because they're close to us.
Right.
They're like, we used to call our dog a doman, a dog human, right? And all our dogs had, everyone names their dogs because they're so close to us. But other than that, the name distinguishes. It's a profound part of our identity. It's one of our first traits of identification is through a name.
I always found it interesting calling a dog or a cat or any pet with a name which they respond to, but what are they specifically responding to? I don't think that a dog named Joe knows that he is Joe. I think that a dog named Joe knows that when you say Joe, he is supposed to answer.
Right. I think the intonation, the sing-song, the cadence of one's voice.
Yeah.
Because if you said to the same, our dog Gypsy, let's say, Gypsy, and if I said Tipsy or Swipsy.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. I remember as a kid discovering that I could call a dog named Joe, and he would still respond in the exact same way.
Right.
Because it's not an identity. It's just a way of communicating. It's a signal. I need your attention now.
That's right.
Like a
it's
bird
a
chirping.
Sign.
Yeah. And this is actually related to something I wanted to talk with you about, which is Jacques Lacan.
Yes.
Which I know that you are a big
Lacanian analyst.
Lacanian analyst. Yeah. And so one thing that he talks about is what you were just talking about is what separates us from animals, if there is anything, but also this moment of identity recognition and the idea of seeing ourselves in the mirror for the first time was, I think, if I'm right, a big thing for Lacan. And I remember I think I remember the first time I saw myself in the mirror when I was a baby crawling on the floor. Yeah.
Wow.
Or at least I remember remembering this. Like
Right.
It's something that stuck with me all these years. And it wasn't a mirror. It was actually a window at night that was reflecting me.
I had that same.
No kidding.
So I'm not sure where you were going to go, but I had this fantasy that I was the girl living. I had this alter ego, and I was her, and she was living outside this home. I had this whole little imaginary thing about this person that I would see living out there, looking at me.
No kidding.
Yeah. I know exactly when you turn the light, or when you. Reflection.
Reflection at night. And at my house when I was growing up, we had these long, we called them Vancouver-style windows in Calgary, which emitted a ton of heat in the winter, so they weren't really good for living in the prairies. But you could have a huge view of the outside, and I could see myself when I was a kid at night. And I bring that up because of the importance of recognition and identity for us as human beings.
Right.
And this is kind of a corollary to the discussion about names, because a name, I think of myself as Ben, but I also think of myself as Benoit, which is my full first name.
Mm-hmm.
There are almost two sides of me. But again, a dog or a cat doesn't think of themselves as Joe.
They're two sides of you because you think of yourself as Ben and as Benoit, and you feel those are two separate.
Sometimes sure.
Two different identities. And Benoit is French.
Yes.
So part of your background is French?
My dad is from Quebec. He's from Montreal. Yeah.
Okay.
And so...
Alors, moi, je suis montréalaise.
Oui, bien sûr. I didn't learn French growing up from my father, which is a part of that identity issue. So I introduce myself as Ben. I'm Ben 90% of the time. But on official documents, I go by Benoit, and when I travel, I go by Benoit, so that I can introduce myself as maybe someone who can speak French or someone who can get by. But it's I bring this up in terms of identity and recognition and understanding how important it is that we see ourselves as a name or as a person that fills the container that is this name. And I wonder, to bring it back, a question for you is, how important is that name, or is it possible that we could conceive of ourselves being human without having a name?
Let me start with the first part. How important is a name? So I'm going to say the name is two parts, right? There is your first name and your surname. And I would say that they have two different, one has a different relationship with both of those. So the first name is a given. It's a given name. It's given from the word gift, from donato. It's a gift given to you by your parents. It's one of the few I'm going to say things because I don't know what word to use. The few things that over which one has no choice. You're given this, and you're told this is who you are. Now, I mean, we can change names, but it is something that you are given and that you take on, and it comes from the outside. It doesn't come from you. You don't choose your name. And the fact that it comes from an other is something that one then has to inhabit and incorporate for oneself. Compare that with the surname. The family name is an inheritance. You inherit your second name. It's your lineage, your tribe, if you want, your ancestry. It follows, your ancestral lineage. And it has a very different function. But so the two together become your name. And one of the things that it's a point that I make in the book, but it's not a strong point. I think if I were to rewrite it, I would build this side up of the notion that the name is a house that you're born into, but that you need to make into your own home. You need to inhabit it. There's that phrase of Goethe, thou shalt inherit from thy son. Now I'm confusing two quotes. That notion of making it your own. You acquire it, but you need to inhabit it and make it your own.
I find that fascinating, this idea of the given name as a gift, as a donation. Mm-hmm. And when we see it on a form, it says given name. And of course, for me, the first name is the same as my last name. They were both something that I had to take. Mm-hmm. That when I grew up, they were just mine. Like that's a great analogy, like a house that you have to make your home.
Yes.
And wouldn't it be wonderful on a form that there could be a chosen name? When you're 18, you must then choose a name that you
So this
have.
is really sweet. After I wrote my book, I received an email from a young girl. She was, I think, 12 or 13, and she emailed me, and she said, I just want you to know, and I wonder what your opinion is. My parents gave me a name, and I have my surname as well, but they told me that when I became a teenager, I could choose my middle name. Do you think that's okay, or do you think there's something wrong with that? And I thought, what a great idea.
Yeah.
That the middle name, that she could choose that for herself, and that she could have her given name, the one that her parents chose for her.
Right.
And that she could choose her own name. Of course, I think it's a wonderful idea. I thought, wow, that's very cool.
Yeah.
Because the given name, don't forget, think of all the energy and effort that goes into choosing a first name.
Sure.
Parents make lists and they
get books.
Exactly. And there's all kinds of fantasies. And we say that the first name contains within it a lot of the projections of parents, meaning all of the wish. I hope she's as beautiful as Marilyn Monroe, if she's Marilyn. Hope she's as bright as Willie, Shakespeare.
Yeah.
I hope may she or he be,
independent or intelligent or successful. Yeah.
And name after those characteristics. We see it in particular in First Nation culture. In Chinese names that are very beautiful, they're often given an Anglo name. But, these Chinese names like the indigenous, he who walks with the sun, or he who blah, blah, that there's a phrase that is a wish as well as maybe a reflection of what an elder may see in the personality or temperament of the child.
Right.
And sometimes within First Nations, there's a naming ceremony that comes later, that one is given a native name that comes not just at birth, but in a naming ceremony at a different stage of one's life.
It's fascinating because we're forced into, as parents, forced into this situation of the anxious situation of having to give our child a name that will lead them to success or happiness or whatever we want for them, but one that they won't get made fun of in school, one that isn't too difficult or foreign sounding, one that will be good for them on a job application, but also one that is strong and stable. For example, for a boy, we have this kind of inherent need to make sure that the boy is going to be strong and stand up for themselves and punch if they get punched, or punch back if they get punched at school, this kind of gender thing. And so then the name's got to be what? Tommy or Jimmy, as opposed to, I don't know, Todd or Kyle. And this is actually something George Carlin made fun of in a skit where he said, I bet you 10 times out of 10, Jimmy, Vinny will beat the shit out of Todd, Kyle, and Tucker. But there's this anxiety as people who have to give these names.
That's right. So I remember meeting a young woman who said that she worked in the event planning, and so she was used to seeing lists of names, and she wanted a name that was unique for her child. And she also would go through cemeteries and see what names, so that she could come up with an interesting name. But when you say, first of all, the Jimmy, Vinny, da-da-da-da, when the person gets older, I don't want to be called Jimmy. I want to be
James
Jim or Jane.
Jim, yeah.
Or Judy. No, I want to be Judith. Or Susie, Suzanne, or it's interesting that one doesn't want those diminutive childhood forms. But I met someone also who said, when I named my children, I thought of three phrases. One was had to do with marriage. Yes, James, I will marry you. Who would be called for a job? Yes, that they had to have. There were three situations: marriage, work, and I think it was a family situation as well. That the name had to be, a strong, powerful name for those situations. And yet they're also all the children of the 60s, where all these these alternative names started coming up. And even today, there are people that name their children names go in decades, right? They're popular names of the 50s. If you Google, you'll see. And so they do go in phases, and there have been times when people wanted very unusual. The 60s was kind of known for that.
Right.
And I think today there's still that, there's a resurgence of unusual names. Sometimes names that you wonder if children will be uncomfortable with. There are also today some, unisex names that sometimes people, I think you mentioned that it's hard to know. Is it, what's the gender?
Yeah, absolutely. And they used, the name Pat for a long time was hard to determine, but now there are many, many names. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a positive development if we want to raise a kid, not necessarily unaware of gender, but a little bit more liberated from gender as a constraint from the very beginning. But there's an interesting concept that I think we talk about very very often in popular culture, which is essentially how a name shapes you, how a name makes you who you are. A name is destiny. And it just goes to the simple thing when you meet someone and you say, oh, yeah, they seem like a Sarah. That person, yeah, that's definitely a Sarah. Could you imagine? They would never be an Yvonne. That's definitely a Sarah. And it's funny, and I just wonder, for someone who studied this, is there truth in that, or is that kind of bogus, this idea that a name actually shapes you?
Well, I think it's possible that a name absolutely, I would say, and then we have these well-known examples, Mr. Steele becoming an engineer,
right.
Or Mr. Brain becoming a neurologist or neurosurgeon. So, because I put a lot of emphasis on language and words, there is a way in which words separated from their meaning can take on a different meaning, or separated from the fixity, so that words get used and incorporated and can have that kind of powerful effect. So I'm going to give a simpler example. It's not quite the same thing. You're just like Uncle Joe, You hear that enough times that there's a kind of a questioning of a young child. Well, Uncle Joe, who's this Uncle Joe, and in what way am I like him, and maybe I am like him. Or the child who's born after a death of a previous child. It's a new child, and yet the parents somehow unconsciously project or react in ways that are then picked up by the child. See, I believe that things are going on below the surface. It's not what we say, it's the messages, it's the meta-link, it's the kind of nonverbal and the tone and the way one can say, you better put on a coat because it's cold outside. And that could be just a plain, straightforward message about safety. But it could also be, oh my God, it's freezing. You could catch you could get many germs.
Sure.
There's a kind of anxiety that can get communicated around safety or around, and we're not always aware of that. But that's what kids pick up, right? They pick up what's not said. They read between the lines, if you want. And there's a lot that gets communicated. And words can also take on, they kind of float and they can take on another meaning, or a meaning that one hadn't thought of, that it can have an effect on us that we're not aware of.
Well, right. And it's also how I receive it. And if I'm told many, many times, not just like you're like your Uncle Joe, but you're clumsy. Well, that might become who I think of myself as, and therefore, in order to be me, I must be clumsy.
Exactly.
That if I'm not clumsy, I'm no longer what I am supposed to be.
Bingo. Yes. I would say that. And even though it's a negative, it becomes there's a familiarity in the symptom, if you want. There becomes something, so that to give that up means I have to become who? Who will I become if I'm not that? Because that I know, even though it's negative, it's familiar and comfortable for me.
Right.
And so if I'm not this clumsy kid, then I'm not sure what my identity is.
Well, and what could be more horrifying than not knowing who I am? I mean,
exactly.
That's almost a philosophical horror.
It's an existential angst, if you want.
Yeah.
And we use the word angst in that sense.
As opposed to angst?
It's the same word.
Oh, okay,
I'm sorry,
okay.
I'm just pronouncing it differently. As opposed to anxiety. Okay. Anxiety has a medical, clinical word, but the kind of that existential angst, or however you want to pronounce it.
No, sorry. Yeah. I thought you were saying, yeah.
I'm opposing it to anxiety, which has
right.
a more medical, clinical.
Whereas angst is more like a feeling or a sensation, perhaps.
It's a kind of, it's a kind of universal dilemma, kind of existential dilemma. For me, it kind of takes me to, my work as an analyst, that for me, we all fall on the spectrum between normal and pathological. There's no, I'm sick, you're well. You're well. We all are somewhere on this spectrum, and we all have to face some very, very big questions. What is life? What is it like to be gendered? What is it like to be a man or a woman? What is it like to be alive or dead? Those big unanswerables are what we all struggle with. What does it mean to be an imperfect being? What does it mean to have limitations? And our history and our experiences have some impact, obviously, and some native our native constitutional temperamental characteristics. But we all struggle, and it's how we struggle and how those events become imprinted and then repeated in unhealthy ways through our life, so that analysis is an attempt to say, why am I responding this way? Why do I continue to? What's the logic? And there's always a logic. It's not random. For me, the question is not, when I work with someone, someone comes in with their narrative. I was abused, I was this, we've got a narrative, each of us. And I'm trying to break up the narrative. So if you were abused as a child, why is it this particular thing. I look for the particularity and the little details that color or that create the texture, the feeling of why this person who's had the same experience as the second person. I'm thinking of cancer. I do a lot of work in the cancer community. So why one person who has a diagnosis and a second with the exact same diagnosis respond differently? Because we're different individuals, because we have different relationships with the disease itself. One may have a history of cancer in the family, There's so many factors that go. But then what is the relationship between a particular body part, let's say breast cancer? Some women have a particular relationship with their breast, right? For others, it's like no big deal, doesn't have the same libidinal, and there's always something there that's very particular and unique about our relationship that becomes often imprinted from very young or from very early.
One thing that Mavis mentioned so far in this episode and continues as a theme is this idea of making your name, which is like a house you have to live in, into a home that you've made your own. Now, coming up in this episode, we talk more about names and also about Mavis's practice as a psychoanalyst and a psychologist. And we talk about how it's important to separate the aesthetic of your name versus how that name sits inside of you. All that's coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. I'm really taken by this conversation because we're talking about narrative and story and how much of ourselves and our world is essentially networked through story. And we as human beings, as a society, but also as individuals, fit into some kind of story, our personal narrative, but also the story of Canada, the story of Toronto, the story of being Jewish, or the story of being French. There's so many stories that network us into ourselves and our communities, but there's also a lot that we're not conscious of that affects our behavior. And I wanted to ask, maybe this is a therapeutic question, but to what extent can you deal with things that a person isn't aware of when you're also dealing with their narrative and trying to find ways for them to redefine their narrative?
But I think that's the level I work at or hope to get to.
Right.
So, yes, one has a narrative, and it's not that one can ignore that, but that's not where I put the emphasis. It's not where I put my emphasis at all. I'm trying to look at what's going on below the surface. And so for me, the classical Freudian term of the formations of the unconscious are slips of the tongue, errors, dreams being the royal road to the unconscious, and very powerful. And dreams have a lot to do with words, right? So I'm thinking of, let's say, I have a patient who dreams about King Lear, right? So Lear is, one that thinks of a daughter, king, and he had 3 daughters, blah, blah, blah. But also Lear is, if you take it away from that, is also to leer.
To leer, yeah.
Right. It has to do with eyes and leering. And so in my work, I often am very attuned to words, trying to separate them from their, from the meaning, from the kind of common meaning, to break up, to have access to what's going on below the surface. So names can have that same, some names have meaning. So a patient whose name is Joy. I mean, that, you don't think of that, but in this particular case, the absence of joy, I say absence of joy, happiness, but absence of joy as the identity of someone.
Whose name is Joy.
Whose name is Joy.
Wow.
And I'm thinking of another case of a person. I'm gonna distort the name. So this person is Persian and had an Arabic-sounding name. I'm going to make up a name. Nakam. Okay, he said, my name is John Nakam. Well, his name is really John Nakim.
Right.
But he's kind of hiding that part of his identity. One of his parents was Persian, the other was Canadian. And that he struggled with that part of his identity for all kinds of reasons, and in today's culture, right, as well. So that had a tremendous impact. So that's part of what happened in terms of the choice of writing the book on names, was seeing this in my practice, as well as my own experience with the Himes thing that I didn't become aware of till much later in life, the extent to which that was part of my own personal journey and my own personal identity. That my name disguises, it doesn't reveal anything. People meet me and they often say, "So what's your background?" And I know what they're asking me. They're my ethnic or my religious background. And I don't want to share that necessarily. I like the fact that Himes doesn't say anything. And I've often thought going through the world as Mavis Himovich is a very different experience than Mavis Himes.
Are you curious as to what that would have been like?
I am. I have thought of it, and I have thought of changing my name at some point, but decided no, I wanted to keep it. But I have wondered about that because it's a very clearly a Jewish-sounding name, that people meeting me have no idea what my identity is.
Well, is it? And
that part of my identity.
Right. And there's two things here. There's the conscious sort of communication of a concept. Himovich sounds Jewish, and there's all the associations with being Jewish. But there's also the rhythm of that, too. Himovich, which is different from Himes. It's a very, and this is where I get curious, coming from just the basis of phenomenological as opposed to semiotic language, right? How does my name Ben Charland, which is an anglicized version of Benoit David Charland, right?
Right, of course.
How does that change who I am, not just in how people relate to me, but in how I relate to myself, having this very hard Ben name? And I wonder if just forget the associations with that.
The sonancy or the assonance of it.
Yes.
The rhythm and the sound of it. I think it has to have an impact. I'm not saying pathological at all.
Sure.
For some people, it is pathological, their relationship with their name. I'm thinking of people who've been abused, whose surname, Stalin's daughter,
right?
Living with her name. I read her book.
Or anyone who has the name Adolf, for example.
Exactly. And there's certainly stories of people who had to change their name. So that one could say that is a that requires some working through. But I'm sure to go through the world as Benoit Charland is very different than Ben Charland. Yes. Yeah. And that has to have some impact on you, that maybe somewhere in your own psyche there's this sense of this dual identity that you have probably had to work out for yourself.
Well, I come from divorced parents as well, so I know that this is there. I've never dealt with it in proper therapy, but I know that this is a part of who
you're
I am.
aware that there is this duality.
Yeah, I'm aware of the emotions that are associated with each side. For example, because I didn't grow up speaking French, I wasn't taught French growing up. I, for a long time, was afraid of saying my name in the French form, because I was afraid I would say it wrong. And actually, I was once corrected by my aunt, who is not the one with a different last name.
Right.
So the aunt on the other side of the family, but still Quebec.
Right.
So an aunt in Quebec who said, no, it's different. It's Charland, not Charlin, or something like that.
Right.
Or maybe it was the reverse.
Because the Quebecois.
In Quebecois, it's more Charlin.
Yeah, exactly.
And in France, of course, is Charland, right? And so I remember like, oh God, I never want to say my name again.
That would have had a very strong impact.
Sure. But therefore, there's a part of myself that I'm not allowed to inhabit.
Exactly.
Because I might say it incorrectly.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's a beautiful example. And that's the kind of thing that I might see in my practice, right? Someone who struggles, I'm not saying you're struggling with it, but someone else may be struggling with it and having a hard time overcoming that inhibition about saying their name.
Right.
And then that can have other tentacles to other issues, other inhibitions, about language learning, for example. Sometimes people who have learning issues, it can be mechanical, but it can also be psychological.
Oh, 100%. I know that for me, I've tried to learn French as an adult, and I can mostly get by in it now. But there was a huge fear for a long time of speaking. Understanding, no problem. But speaking, writing, no problem. But speaking is...
you would be inhibited.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I wonder to what extent, and not just language, but to what extent does your name give you a passport into a certain world, but also whatever the opposite of a passport would be, like a sort of
an
hindrance, an obstacle, saying you can't enter here. So if my name is Ben, am I allowed to go into a mosque? Right? I mean, clearly I'm not. My name announces me as someone who is not Muslim.
Right.
And what spaces can I not go into? For example, I mean, that's just a glib example, but there must be others.
I think, well, think of carrying a name like Kennedy. You know, that opened doors, or Rockefeller, or one judges, just in the same way we started the discussion around ethnicity, but certain names announce a certain je ne sais quoi, or a certain social status. And that was very true in medieval times, when names were associated with land and territory and insignia and crowns and, emblazoned on shields, and, and one had... a coat of arms.
Coat of arms.
Or all those icons, that that are associated with the family name.
Right.
And then we would have, and it's still in a much toned down form, well, you can't behave like that. We're the so-and-sos, and we eat properly, and we have proper etiquette, and we don't do this, and we don't wear jeans, or we don't,
Yeah.
I think today we're living in a very informal society, and we don't see that. There's certain cultures that still have some of those mores associated with them.
Well, I remember growing up, my grandfather, my mother's father, so the English Canadian side of my family, had a coat of arms on top of the fireplace for his family name, and it was very powerful and very regal. Now, this is a middle-class family, and there's no royalty in there or anything, but it was aspiring to be as if it were a powerful family. And I think that you mentioned that our society today is informal. I think another way to say it is untethered. There's a lot of untethering from a common purpose or a united way of receiving the news, for example, is a common theme on this podcast, that no one receives the news through one source anymore. It's all fragmented, but also in silos at the same time. But we're also untethered to our names. My last name, I mean, most people's last name and first name, what does that mean? It's just a sound. I mean, I'm not saying there's no association. Of course there is. But I'm saying whereas you mentioned in the Middle Ages, there was a very strong understanding of my lineage, my family, what allows me to do in that, what my place in society is. I mean, Shakespeare's Wheel of Fortune, right? So that it's almost wrong for you to get out of your station in life, whether it's going down or going up.
It's like the Indian caste system.
Absolutely. And in our society, it's completely open.
And we've lost that. I mean, even in British society, that also had that.
The stratification of class. Yeah.
I think we're losing something in that untethering. I think we're losing a sense of identity, not in its rigidity, in its kind of classicist stigma form, but I think we're losing our bearings a bit.
Yeah.
When you say it struck me when you said things are being untethered and we're getting information from different sources. And I think even within family values, I think there's, we went from strict to super liberal. And I think the pendulum shifts always, And I think we're in a very different time now, where I think there's been such a loosening of mores that I wonder if there's some confusion there.
I think, furthermore, just to add to that we've always talked about the pendulum swinging one way and then the other. I think that we now live in a time where the pendulum is both on one side and the other. Because I can think of people who are strict, and I can think of people who are super liberal. there is no sense that we're all on one end of the pendulum. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
And that is a part of this untethering. We're untethered from the pendulum itself.
Yes, I would say I agree with you on that. I think a really good point. And I think people then, especially young people, it's confusing for them in terms of who am I? We see this in the whole transgender, we see it happening like anything goes and everything goes, and a lot of experimentation and a lot of not sure. And I don't think there's anyone, who are the pillars, who are the anchors for the young? Who do they turn to when it's very loosey-goosey?
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess there's the backlash of the, the fundamentalist,
Sure.
the kind of very ultra to the letter of the law. There's no fluidity. It's kind of rigid and bound.
Which are two poles of the human experience anyways.
Right.
And it's interesting, in my research on Lacan before this conversation, one thing that he talked about was that we might see ourselves as democratic, but deep down we desire authority. Deep down we desire someone to come in and...
There is a need to have some... But we need some more... We need some brushstroke. It's for us to work out the particularities, but there have to be some system that we all kind of live by. Otherwise, there's nothing. Right?
Well, and that's the risk, perhaps, is that that system is now either in question or being broken down. And so then I define for myself what the system is, which may be good, may be bad, but this goes back to the idea of naming. 100 years ago, it would be absurd to be able to make up your own name. Today, it's very acceptable. I don't want to say it's fashionable, but it's becoming normal. If someone says to me, you can literally go to a registry and just change your name. It's not that hard to do.
In Canada, you can name anything except a number or a sign, like a $, or any kind of those...
symbols,
like
a $sign or a colon.
Otherwise,
or something.
Anything goes in Canada.
Right. And what do you think of that? I mean, based on what we were just talking about in terms of a society that we look towards systems, but we're also breaking them down. There's a very liberal streak, and I mean liberal in the classic British sense, libertarian. You get to do whatever you want. You want to make up your own name, that's totally cool. But is there something, I don't want to say pathological, but is there something problematic about that?
I do think so. And I think it's okay if you want to make up a nickname or a middle, we do that. But there's kind of, I always question when one changes a name. That to me is like, it can be, if it's not coming out of, as I say, a situation of abuse or some particular reason why one would change the name, but just, I feel like it. I don't know. I mean, I think there's something, I think it's always worth examining that, because even the shortening of the name Heimovich to Himes, or all of those Jews that, the research in France showed that there are a lot of people who were upset that their parents changed their names and said, you sold us out, that you didn't, why did you give up so easily? Even though parents were changing names to make the life of their children better by avoiding the discrimination that they lived through. There are a lot of people of the next generation who wanted to revert back to their original name, saying that, that taking the pride of, being whatever it is that that their parents were trying to hide. Now, it was a different social situation there. But, there is something about what you're given as a kind of, this is,
Yeah, like a gift, as you said.
Yeah, and to incorporate that, to kind of make it you don't like it. I got to say, I never liked the name Mavis. I've never liked the name Mavis. My middle name is Carol, and I never really thought of changing to Carol, but Mavis is not, I don't know. It just, it is who I am now. I can't imagine being anything else.
Right.
But I never thought of changing it. Yeah.
But so then is that your cross to bear, so to speak? I mean, the idea
I
of
don't feel it as I just don't find it an attractive name. I like the fact that it's unique, I suppose.
yeah. But I think there are people today who feel the same way you do and say, well, I'm going to change it then. I'm just going to make up something different.
I think the thing here is we've got to separate the aesthetic of the name. I don't like the name because I don't like the aesthetic.
Sure.
As opposed to how that name sits in me, how I've internalized what it is to be Mavis, whatever that is.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm not so attached to. I think one can then, when you are at peace with your name, you can let it go in a sense. It doesn't rule you. It's like part of you. It doesn't take over, because I'm not Mavis, who looks like, who was named after, I was named after a great aunt who was apparently a terrible lady. My grandmother's sister. And I thought, why did they, well, it was a Hebrew name, Malka, and then so Mavis became the Anglo.
Okay.
But and even my Hebrew name, Malka, which means queen, is considered a very old-fashioned Hebrew name. It's like Bertha, or it's like, Zelda.
Helga.
It's like an old... in fact, I lived in Israel for a while and worked there, and when people met me, they said they thought they were going to meet some, octogenarian or something, or some older person, based on my, again, just based on the sound of my name, or based on the association to the name.
But to go back to your analogy about the house and home, it's very similar. Like, I may have grown up in a kind of a rundown house, but that was my home, and I'm proud of it. And that, or proud maybe is not the right word, or it is me.
It is you, and you're comfortable.
Yeah. Whether I like it or not,
Right.
I'm comfortable with who I am and who I was, and I might choose to live in a different house today.
Absolutely.
But I can't forget who I was, or I'm really at a loss. Then I'm really untethered in a dangerous way if I choose to forget. I want to get to I got 10 things for you to close out our conversation.
10? Only 10?
Well, I've got 100 if you want, but I'm going to start with 10.
Yeah.
So these are just words or phrases, and just to get your quick reaction to. So in this, brevity is a gift. The first one is Lacan.
Lacan. Well, he's, for me, a model. I mean, for me, Freud Lacan, who's a genius, and who comes the closest to, he's not well known, but the closest to a broad understanding of the human psyche that really means a lot to me, that has been very valuable for me.
Yeah.
And because he married Freud, the unconscious, with linguistics, with classics, with the humanities, with anthropology, and so there's a broad spectrum of study that he incorporated, and in spite of the verbosity and density of his work, there's a mystery in there too, that he doesn't straitjacket people, and has an appreciation of the unknown as well as the known.
This is something that you've dealt with a lot, which is what we didn't talk about, the balance between creativity and psychoanalysis, and how the creative act is very similar, if not the same thing, as the psychoanalytic act.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's something he dealt with, yeah.
That's right. So creativity, because we can't always deal with life's mysteries, and we can't always talk about them, we can express, there's a way of expressing it through music, through dance, through visual arts, that can touch on something that can't always be said into words, and that's very therapeutic.
The next one is something we've talked about, which is anxiety.
Anxiety. Something that's embodied, that's a symptom, that speaks. When one is anxious, that anxiety is saying something. It's saying, I'm getting close to something that's dangerous, that one has to listen. It's the only affect that doesn't lie. You can fake happiness, you can fake tears, you can fake a lot of things, but anxiety, you can't fake. It's embodied. Your heart's pounding, you're sweating. You can't fake that. And it's important to listen. And in a lot of work that's done psychotherapeutically is to work with ways of eliminating anxiety, take pills, do meditation, relaxation. What I try and do is go go into that and say, what is it that's creating the anxiety? Not, sure, someone wants to manage it with, some techniques, but the buzzword tools and techniques, that's not what I do. I try and look at what's creating anxiety. What's the source of that anxiety?
Right.
What is it that you're getting close to, rather than just Band-Aid it and eliminate it, because it'll pop up somewhere else. Let's go into the anxiety. As much as one can tolerate, of course.
It's, for me, I mean, just in hearing you describe that, it sounds like one of the most interesting emotions or interesting states we can be in.
That's right. Most terrifying.
Terrifying, but terrifying in an existential sort of way. Like, to be, it's because it's not just fear. It's not just
fear.
Fight or flight. It's something
That's right.
deeper and more profound than that.
It's not as specific. You can say I'm scared of heights or of dogs or this, but anxiety has a kind of free-floating form to it. But there always is an object. There always is something that is creating the anxiety.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The third one is name.
Name, in French, because I read French for Lacan, nom is name. It's also noun. And it's homophonic with no, which is nom de père, the name of the father, the no of the father. That goes into a whole theoretical model. So name is a big...
Yeah, it's a big one.
Yeah, it's a big one. I haven't answered that.
That's okay.
I'm not sure I can answer it.
No, that's okay. The next one might be just as interesting. It's self.
Self. Not a word I use at all.
How
it's
come?
not in my vocabulary. What is the self? I don't know. I think in terms of identity, identification, ego. A self is a kind of nothing word. What does that even mean?
Right.
It's not in my vocabulary.
Interesting.
Clinically.
Right. No,
Yeah. People come in and say, I have low self-esteem, I have low self-confidence, and I ask them to elaborate. What is that? I want to know what that is. It's a kind of it's too catch-all for me. It doesn't have any meaning.
There's a really interesting book, I don't know if you've heard of it, by Will Storr called Selfie.
I know I'm thinking of another Storr who's an analyst.
No,
okay. I don't know that one.
And he's a British writer. It's a fascinating book about sort of the history of the self through the last few hundred years especially, and how we've come to worship the idea of the self.
Yeah, well, bullshit to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, not his book, because
no,
I think the concept. Now that you say that, the selfie thing, I mean, it speaks to what on earth is going on.
Yeah.
What on earth is going on with selfies?
That's right.
My God, you can't travel anywhere in the world without people. They don't even see what they're doing in the world.
I think it's so interesting.
I think it's. I find it horrific. It bothers me so much, all this.
It bothers me too, but I also find it is an answer to the question, what on earth is going on? What on earth is going on? Everyone's taking pictures of themselves. Yeah. That begs the question, why?
Right.
Why are we doing? Is it just because we can? Are we doing the same thing that an ape or a monkey would do if it had the ability to take these pictures of itself? Are we just being children, or is there something deeper happening?
Right.
Is there something?
I think so.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that you're a lot younger than I am. I sometimes think, am I just getting old?
No, I don't think so.
And so it's kind of refreshing to hear that you question that as well, because I think the society with technology, etc.
Yeah,
has shifted.
But I wonder too, because I'm 35, so I grew up without a lot of technology. I mean, obviously, there's no human can say they grew up without technology, but I didn't grow up with cell phones. I didn't have a cell phone until I was 20 or 21 or something. Today, every kid is a digital native, and I don't know if they would have the same reaction I would have. But at the same time, we all see it.
Yeah.
We all know what we're doing. Mm-hmm. We can laugh at it and be ironic about it. We know that we are selfie sticks. Yeah. We know how stupid that is. I think that you could be 18 or 88 and understand the absurdity of a selfie stick. It doesn't stop us from using it. Mm-hmm. But it still begs the question, why are we doing this?
And why are we so obsessed with ourselves? So maybe that there's a kind of narcissistic self-focus, as if we can't take ourselves out of it. We can't just appreciate what's out there without putting ourselves in there.
Yeah, exactly.
I find that disturbing for the younger generations.
Right, and this book, just to go back to it quickly, Selfie, essentially says that is new, that it has not always been this way.
Right.
Because some people react, well, we're always obsessed with ourselves. We've always been like that.
No, I don't think
And I
in
don't
the
think
same
that's
way.
true.
I don't see it in the same way.
The next one is Mavis.
Mavis. Oh, boy. If you ask me that today, I mean, it's interesting. My first thought is if you ask me at different times in my life, I'm twice your age. Mavis is a very complex being who loves the arts and is very engaged with the arts, who's also loves nature and is very much a wilderness person. So this duality in my personality that we talked about before the show started, of enjoying both culture and nature, and who hopefully has a big social conscience that does work, good works with others outside of my practice, and who tries to have a moral integrity and respect myself and others.
Himes.
Himes. The diminutive of my family name, Haimovich, that I inherited, that was abbreviated in order to make my father's and our family's life easier, that I suppose a part of me is Haimovich. Like the name, people meet me and don't know the impact of my Jewish identity on me. My husband is not Jewish. We celebrate, holidays that are Jewish holidays and non-Jewish holidays. And so people don't know the strong impact of my Jewish identity. And that that's reflected in Haimovich, but that's hidden by Himes.
Sure.
And it's kind of mirrored in the way I approach my name as well.
It's interesting because the next one then is Mask.
The name is hidden. Its origins are hidden. I don't relate to Mask. I don't see... Personally, I sure as hell hope that I don't wear a mask, and I certainly spend my life trying to be on. I'm pretty direct communicator. I don't mince words. I'm pretty upfront. In my practice as well, I would say, that it's important to be honest. So I associate mask with dishonesty.
Right.
And that doesn't, I don't relate to that.
Okay. The next one then is maybe another way to look at it, but take it as you will, which is privacy.
Privacy. I don't know if you're asking personal or general.
So let me give you the background in this one word. This is the word that I make sure I ask in every single time I do the 10 things, because it's a political issue, because it's a big picture problem in our society that we don't talk about almost at all. But we all know that it's an issue, this idea that being on social media or having Google speakers listening to every word we say in some homes, it's an issue. It's something that's happening. When we ask what on earth is going on, privacy should be on the tip of our tongue because of the way that our society is unfolding. But there is, of course, a very personal dimension, and the reason why I asked it in the way that I did is because while you feel that you're being upfront with the world, there's also a need for many people to have a private space, and a mask can be a way to be private.
Okay.
But you can take that wherever you like.
For me, privacy becomes more a physical, psychological choice not to share and not to divulge. I don't do any social media. I have a website now, but I don't. I'm not on Facebook. In fact, a friend of mine, I did have a brief Facebook account, posted something, and I ended up hearing from 2 patients, "Oh, I didn't know you were in Patagonia," or something, or "Oh, you look cute," or whatever. And this is not what I want. So I don't want anyone taking my photo unless I know about it. I don't want it posted anywhere.
Sounds like you value privacy quite a bit.
I value privacy in my work. It's important. So in that sense, privacy is important. And at a personal level, I choose what I choose to share with friends, with family, whatever. But what you said in terms of the culture today being so public, I guess I didn't grow up with it. I'm aware of it, but I haven't really addressed the issue. I see it more an issue for the public, for today.
Yeah.
It's all over, the kind of the exposure of one's measurements, one's body measurement, one's taste preference, everything. I guess I don't relate to just my generation.
Well, and it's the last one then is social media, and it's I understand that you don't engage with it, but it still must.
It has an impact.
Yeah,
it has an impact. But I try and use it for my benefit, but not to be used by it.
Right.
I try and kind of set some control. I know that I'm of a generation that didn't grow up with, and still I have friends who are on Facebook, etc., but for various reasons. And, I have extended family overseas, so I use some of the apps to keep, I'm savvy. I don't want to be, stick my head in the sand. So I use it to my advantage. I don't want it to rule me. I try and control it.
Right, which is the one of the defining features of technology and social media and the internet today is being users of it, not being used by it.
That's right.
Mavis, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me on your show.
To learn more about Mavis Himes, go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find out more about not only Mavis, but about this particular episode and the references that were made in this conversation. You can also find a way to get in touch with me on email or by social media. Let me know what you think of this episode and listen to all other episodes as well. Now, your quote of the week is from a comedian named Mitch Hedberg, who passed away actually in 2005. There's a bit of comedy to it, but I think it talks about what we've been talking about. It goes, "I wish my name was Brian, because then maybe sometimes people would misspell my name and call me Brain. That's like a free compliment, and you don't even gotta be smart to notice it." Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein for this wonderful music, and special thanks to my guest Mavis Himes for the use of her office in Toronto, Ontario for us to record. Next week, we're talking with CBC polling analyst and correspondent Eric Grenier on politics and polling. I'll see you then.